Hello. So yesterday I had the enormous pleasure of presenting at my favorite online seminar, which is the CRISP seminar on theme vowels, categories, and categorization. Yesterday, by the way, was the the 20th of February, uh, 2025, now the 21st. And I announced that this talk was happening on Facebook, and there was some interest from people who weren't able to go to it. And so I thought I would do this video, which is kind of a debriefing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the talk itself, and in some places during the actual giving of the talk, and in some cases afterwards, I will bring up and mention comments people made, questions people had. Because the session itself wasn't recorded for good reasons. It's a sort of relatively informal, sort of low stakes uh, deal, this seminar, and people were understandably leery about recording it, and I understood that. So this is the alternative. For the same reason, I'm not going to be explicit about who said what, even when I remember, because I don't have anybody's permission to tie them to things that they may have said during the meeting. But I do want to issue some sort of generic thank yous before I start to Guy Tabachnik, Guido van den Wingard, Jeroen van Kranenbroek, Meg Smith, Christopoulos, Edo Cavarani, Masha Bechlin, and Heather Newell. And apologies to anybody who made helpful comments that I missed in my notes, but generic thanks to all those and to everybody that came to see the talk. Now I'm going to be doing this in one take, so it's not going to be an especially polished presentation necessarily, because I have neither the time nor really the skills to do video editing. Uh, Anything else I was supposed to mention before we did this? I think that's it. Let's just start. So I'm gonna show you the handout and just talk through it, and and we'll see how we go. Okay, so I'm gonna try and ensure that this is big enough for people to see, and I can't really tell whether it is or not. So I'm just gonna err on the side of making the thing absolutely enormous. Okay, here we are. So the title of this talk was Romance Conjugation Class Features Could Be Syntactic, and on certain assumptions must be. So here's the point. Bermúdez Otero formulates this question associated with theme vowels, the coupling question. So how are stems correctly coupled with their corresponding theme vowels? And this talk is about that question as it arises in Latin and Romance verb morphology. And I'm going to argue for the following conclusions. If you're committed to the idea that the lexicon contains simple pieces only, then conjugation class features remain the best answer to the coupling question in Latin and Romance verbs. The caveat, if you're committed to the idea that the lexicon contains simple pieces only, is in footnote 1, which I will read to you rather than scrolling down and giving you seasickness. So this stricture that I have put myself under, but which you need not put yourself under if you don't believe it, rules out the solution to the coupling question that Bermúdez Otero himself proposes, which requires permitting the narrow lexicon to contain complex structures made up of more than one piece. In a different sense of lexicon, it also rules out nanosyntactic approaches in terms of the structural size of the verb stems lexical entry, such as Kortula 2023 and Fabregas 2022, 2023A, and 2023B. Those perspectives deserve a lot more attention and engagement than they will receive in this presentation. But here I'm just sort of like laying out the consequences of adopting certain assumptions. So if you are like a distributed morphologist person is committed to the idea that the lexicon contains simple pieces only, then I will argue conjugation class features, whatever their vices might be, are still the best answer to the coupling question in Latin and Romance verbs. Secondly, I'll argue that although standard versions of distributed morphology are associated with the claim that conjugation class features cannot be syntactic, the traditional arguments for this position don't go through in versions of DM with late insertion at both interfaces. That much is enough to establish the thesis that conjugation class features could be syntactic, and that's going to be one of the main takeaways that I'm urging here. There's a second one, which is that for a while now, in secret, mostly, I've been working on a version of DM which adheres to strict modularity, Fodor plus modularity, as I've been calling it, of the kind advocated for instance, by Newell and Saylor, 2023, and they in turn are taking inspiration from Tobias Shear and others. I've come to the conclusion that if this version of a strictly modular DM that I have been working on is correct, then Romance conjugation class features must be syntactic, in fact. And there ought to be time for me to tell you why. So here's the roadmap. We're going to talk about why conjugation class features are still the best response to the coupling question in a DM-like framework. Section 2 gives you the argument that conjugation class features could in fact be syntactic after all. Section 3 is about strict Fodor plus modularity. Section 4 presents an argument that conjugation class features must be syntactic in a certain version of strictly modular DM. And 5 is the conclusion. So as I mentioned, this is all about the coupling question. But alongside the coupling question, theme vowels also raise something that we might call the identity question. Namely, do theme vowels correspond to one or more syntactic terminals? And if so, which ones? This question will mostly just float around in the background in this presentation, and it never quite comes into focus. But one's answer to the coupling question constrains one answer to the identity question. So given that I'm going to be arguing that conjugation class features could be syntactic and perhaps must be, that would commit me to answering yes to the first half of the identity question, right? The theme vowel itself would certainly have to correspond to something in the syntax if its features are syntactic. But other than that, I will say no more about the identity question. There are various possible answers that are consistent with what I will say. Now then, why conjugation class features? I take it to be uncontroversial that conjugation class membership in Latin and Romance is not plausibly reducible to any independent semantic, morphosyntactic, or phonological factor. There's a footnote here, which I shall read to you, about Kastner and Martin, or Martin, 2021, which might spring to some people's mind as a potential counterexample to this bullet, but it is not, for the following reason. So Kastner and Martin show experimentally that French speakers are aware that change of state predicates are statistically overrepresented in the French IR verbs, often called the second conjugation, and that new change of state predicates can be assigned to that otherwise unproductive-looking conjugation class. They argue on this basis that the is element, usually taken to be this conjugation's theme suffix, actually has at least one substantive alloceme. Nevertheless, French is not a counterexample to the statement in the main text, since Kastner and Martin also show that there are change of state verbs in other conjugations and non-change of state verbs in the second conjugation. Hence, conjugation class membership is not reducible to any independent semantic factor, even on Kastner and Martin's analysis of French. Now, in the earliest generative works on Romance morphophonology, accounts of this appeal to bespoke conjugation class features. So people like Harris, 1969, on Spanish have features like plus first conjugation, and so on. Likewise, Saltarelli on Italian, and implicitly also Saint-Fachien on French, although the features are never actually talked about in an explicit fashion. Later, I think the first to do this was Davis, 1991, a dissertation on Spanish. Independently, Carlos Oregui proposed a version of the same idea for Spanish in the year 2000, and then very famously also Massuet, 1999, for Catalan, proposed that conjugation class features should be broken down and the conjugations themselves cross-classified according to a feature geometry over which Markowitz relationships could be defined. And that allowed for a way of dealing with cases of morphological neutralization in conjugation classes, syncretism in other words, an important point to which we return. Now then, nevertheless, there's been persistent unease about these features and an accompanying desire to do away with them. I think at the root of this unease are two things. One, the apparent ad hocness of the features, and secondly, the perception that they commit one to morphology-specific mechanisms, including perhaps a morphomic level along the lines of Aronoff 1994. Now, there is, I think, no getting away from the ad hocness. Things are going to be ad hoc sometimes, sorry. But I will be offering some comfort on the second bullet. So I think they do not, in fact, commit one to morphology-specific mechanisms. Now then, let's talk about some alternatives to conjugation class features that have been proposed in a bit more detail. So Bermúdez-Otero's solution to the coupling question is that complex stems are the input to the grammar. So in my one here, I've got two stems corresponding to the Spanish lexeme that means to find or to encounter. And you can see in the syntactic part of these representations, you've got a complex treelet, right? And Bermúdez Otero's idea is that the smallest things in the narrow lexicon that have theme vowels in them are always at least this big. And that means you don't need any independent way of linking up the theme vowel with the corresponding root or verbalizer or whatever it might be, right? Again, this is for this solution, which has a number of elegant properties, is foreclosed to me because I put myself under the stricture of disallowing complex internal structure in the narrow lexicon. So for me, the input to merge has to be an individual piece. The smallest, the first instance of merge, that is, of course. You can have merge applying recursively, but the only way to get a structure like that would be to do a merge, right? Given the strictures I put myself under. Now then, in the narrow syntactic literature recently, including in Modular 2023 on Friulian and a series of fantastic papers by Antonio Fabregas, culminating in this 2023 paper, has stem size in the nanosyntactic lexicon interacting with theme vowel size. So what this means is that, so for Fabregas, for example, proposes that theme vowels realize different sizes of structure corresponding to the top end of the thematic domain. So this is sort of an exploded version of Gillian Ramchand's event phrase, for example. And the idea is that you've got, the theme vowel A, which corresponds to this big chunk of that structure, the theme vowel E from the third conjugation, a somewhat smaller chunk, and the theme vowel E, the smallest of all, that just corresponds to this topmost chunk of that event phrase domain. And then you have your verb stems specified as swallowing up the lower part of the thematic domain and some amount of the exploded event phrase, and the amount of the exploded event phrase that they subsume will determine which theme vowel gets to go. So, for example, if you've got a verb root like beb in my 3, which is drink, that swallows up 2 out of the 3 projections in the exploded event phrase. And that means that when you come to try and spell out a theme vowel, like in my 2, you'll be left with only being able to choose morpheme C here, right? So this beb is a second conjugation verb because its stem consumes 2 out of the 3 projections of the event phrase and leaves you with your only option being theme vowel allomorph to C. Quite brilliant, but again, foreclosed to me because in a different sense of lexicon, we've here got treelets in the lexicon. There's a third option, which does not raise the same issues of architecture. That is, it would be compatible with my favored architectural strictures. And that's that deny that theme vowels are separate morphemes at all. Have them be part of the phonological underlying representation of the root. So this is entertained in passing in some unpublished work by Chantil Spionin on Italian. It's also the essence of what Spelti and Spelti 2004 and Emmons and Spelti 2005 propose for Latin noun declension. Now, as I say here, that third approach does not raise broader architectural issues, but it is nevertheless unacceptable to me and to many others working on Romance theme vowels since the 60s. And the next section talks about 2 reasons why. So, here is why conjugation class features are a better option than not segmenting out Romance theme vowels. The 2 arguments are called Harris's argument and the argument from syncretism. Harris's argument is so called because it's first stated for Spanish by Harris in the following terms, Harris 69. There are just 3 conjugational classes and hence 3 different theme vowels. This fact is not captured if each theme vowel is fully specified in the lexicon. By that he means is part of the root of the underlying representation of the stem. That is, if theme vowels are fully specified lexically, then it is a lexical idiosyncrasy of each verb stem that its theme vowel is not oo or o. This is simply wrong. And there was some question about whether the regularity here could be just purely diachronic and not part of synchronic grammar, but I don't think that's plausible because if that were true, one would expect borrowings of verb stems from other languages to be able to create new theme vowels in Romance languages. And as far as I know, that has never happened. So the problem that Harris is talking about here has to have a synchronic solution and a diachronically stable one at that, apparently. Now, while the number of conjugation classes and of theme vowels varies across Romance languages, the force of Harris's argument holds just as well for all of them, as far as I can see. In fact, better, because most of the other Romance languages have larger vowel inventories than Spanish. So there are more like accidental absences for the non-separation account to be embarrassed by in, say, Italian, which has a seven vowel system. A version of Harris's objection also applies to the analysis of Latin nominal declension in Spelty 2004 and Edmonton Spelty 2005. So when Spelty claims in the 2004 paper that Latin noun stems can end in any of the phonemes of the language, he's not telling the truth. That neglects the fact that vowel length is phonemic in Latin. And once you take phonemic vowel length into account properly, and you properly remove the case and number endings from the ends of the nouns, and you correctly look at the underlying representations of the stem that's left behind rather than the surface forms, one finds that noun stems never end in long A, short E, long I, long O, or long U underlyingly. So, in other words, half of the phonemic vowel inventory is missing from the relevant environment. There's a footnote here about longo. So there are surface nouns in the third declension, in particular, where the nominative singular ends in a longo. These are not counterexamples to the generalization of the text. They always involve an underlying n, deleted word finally. So, for example, in sermo, nominative singular, sermonis, genitive singular, the n crops up. Sometimes with compensatory lengthening and quality alternation when the preceding vowel is underlyingly short. So, for example, for person or man, homo hominis, that's going to be from underlying homon with a short O and an N. And then in the nominative singular, you've got the N dropping and compensatory lengthening. In the other case forms, you've got a weakening of that short O to I. And in that respect, I'm following Oniga 2014, page 74. If one were tempted to extend the Spelty Emmons tradition to Latin verb conjugation, one would run into the question of why no verb stem shorn of its inflectional suffix ends in an underlying short A, short I, short E, long O, or with the possible exception of one verb, short O and U. And also the question of why stem final long U is found only in certain perfectum and third stems. So why would that be morphologically restricted in that way? The position that says that the theme vowel is a separate morpheme has an answer. The non-segmenting tradition does not. Okay, so that's the argument known as Harris's argument. The second argument is the argument from syncretism. Now, in many Romance languages, theme vowel distinctions, most commonly but not only between ere and ire verbs, collapse in certain tense, mood, or aspect combinations. In many such cases, this neutralization doesn't seem to be statable in phonological terms, but a description in terms of morphological syncretism does work. I don't know why I did a monophthongal tense mid-vowel on cases there. God knows. Anyway. But a description in terms of syncretism does work, right? So there are cases like this where you can't really state the generalization in phonological terms. But if you state the generalization in terms of syncretism, you're presupposing that theme vowels are separate morphological pieces rather than being part of the root. And Spanish exhibits an especially dramatic instance of this kind of neutralization. So let me just zoom out so that you can see the table here, and then I'll zoom back in again if I remember. The yellow shaded cells here correspond to neutralizations which I do not think are reducible to phonological issues. So on the left here, you've got a paradigm for the verb comer, a second conjugation verb meaning to eat. And on the right, you've got the same for the verb vivir, which means to live, and it's the third conjugation verb. And as you can see in the yellow shaded cells, in those you've got E rather than E surfacing systematically in the second conjugation. And for example, if you look at the imperfect here, you get comía. There's nothing. There would be nothing wrong in Spanish if that had come out as comía. Like that's a perfectly sensible sort of sequence of sounds in Spanish, but it's not what you get. Likewise, take the past participle comido rather than comedo. So there's certainly nothing phonologically wrong with comedo. In fact, you get that sequence in certain derived nominals based on this same verb. So comedor, for example, which means dining room, and also sort of one who eats, I guess, as an agentive nominal. You get the normal second conjugation theme vowel in comedor, but in the past participle it's comido. So and these betoken a neutralization at the morphological level of these two conjugation classes in these environments highlighted in yellow. There's a couple of side notes here which are sort of details about the analysis of Spanish, which I will skip, but those of you who are interested in Spanish in particular will, I think, want to read them. The handout will be placed, a link to it, that is, will be placed in the description of this video so that you can do that. Or you could just pause it now, I guess, and read it off the screen. Here I've collected other instances of theme vowel neutralization / conjugation class syncretism, as you might call it. So in Portuguese, the second conjugation collapses with the third conjugation in the past participle and in the imperfect indicative. In the present subjunctive, they both have a, so that's sort of like a proper subset of the environments in which this collapse happens in Spanish. In Italian, the third conjugation collapses with the second conjugation in the gerund. So for example, you have vendere, to sell, going to vendendo, which you would expect. But dormire goes to dormendo, not dormindo. So that you've got the collapse happening in the opposite direction. In the present subjunctive, both have a or ya, depending on the person and number combination. In Catalan, the second conjugation collapses with the third conjugation in the imperfect indicative. Both the first conjugation and the second conjugation have e in the present subjunctive, first and second person plural forms. So these occur in different ways in different Romance languages. Just to put some flesh on the bones here, here's some examples from Catalan from Altra Massuet, 1999. So this illustrates the neutralization of the second and third conjugations in the Catalan imperfect. So the second conjugation verb demer here means to fear, and then you've got these third conjugation verbs sortir, which means to go out, I think, and unir, which means to join. And you can see that the usual short, unstressed e that you get in the second conjugation does not appear in the imperfect indicative. Instead, you get e, which is the third conjugation theme vowel ordinarily. So, as foreshadowed in section 1.1, this type of pattern, like other syncretism patterns, can be captured if conjugation classes are cross-classified by more primitive features. So here's how Altra Massuet did this for Catalan. Her idea was that there's a feature plus minus alpha, and the first conjugation is minus alpha, all others are plus alpha. There's another feature plus minus beta. The second conjugation is plus beta. The third conjugation subcases are both minus beta, and then there's another subfeature plus minus gamma, which distinguishes the two subgroups of third conjugation verbs. Then she sets up this system of vocabulary items. So in number 7 here, the important ones here are highlighted using this delightful Microsoft Word oval. So the second conjugation theme vowel is something that spells out that it's like the default allomorph for plus beta. And the ordinary third conjugation theme vowel is this one, and that's the elsewhere allomorph for plus alpha, right? From this point, all you need to get the imperfect syncretism is a rule deleting plus beta in the environment of the imperfect indicative. And that will make the second conjugation theme vowel too specific to be inserted, and the third conjugation theme vowel will win, even with a second conjugation verb like demer, but by the elsewhere condition, right? And that's the impoverishment rule that Altra Massuet proposes is given in 8, right? So, interim summary. If you're working within a DM-like architecture, one where non-trivial triolets cannot occur as part of the narrow lexicon on the vocabulary, then conjugation class features remain the best approach to Latin and Romance theme vowels. This is because Romance theme vowel allomorphy exhibits neutralization patterns, syncretism in other words. With conjugation class features, the normal DM tools for dealing with such patterns, under specification, the elsewhere condition, and impoverishment can go to work. Without conjugation class features, they can't. And that's the argument. So this argument has convinced me that I must live with conjugation class features. Therefore, I must confront the question of their status. And if you are convinced by this argument, so must you. Now, traditional DM, starting with Ultramaswet 1999, takes them to be dissociated in the sense of MBIC 1997. That is not part of syntactic representations, but introduced in the PF component. And this next section, section 2, revisits the arguments for that. So section 2 is called Conjugation Class Features Could Be Syntactic. So at the beginning of this section, I have a series of quotations from various works in the DM literature highlighting the sorts of reason that I myself believed for 20 odd years that we've always, as DMers, thought that these guys could not be syntactic, conjugation class features, that is. I shall highlight just one here, a couple, actually. Let's highlight this one from Embeck and Neuer's handbook article from 2007. The alternative to the notion of dissociated morphemes, namely requiring that all pieces be syntactic, is a stronger position since it admits no non-syntactic pieces at all. However, this alternative would require the presence of functional heads in the syntax that possess no semantic content. An undesirable move inasmuch as it complicates the syntactic derivation with objects that play, by hypothesis, no role in syntax or semantics. In a footnote immediately after that passage, Embeck and Neuer cite a remark in Chomsky 2001 that functional categories lacking semantic features require complication of phrase structure theory. A departure from good design to be avoided unless forced. Compare also the reasoning leading to the abolition of agonos in Chomsky 1995. That's not, I intoned that as if the compare also the reasoning part was part of the quote. It's not. That's me adding that on. So if you remember, with whatever degree of fondness you remember it, why Chomsky abolished ago in that book, it was because they consisted only of uninterpretable features and would get deleted. But if you've got a functional head and all of its features are deleted, what happens to the things in its specifier? It doesn't seem to make sense, so we get rid of them, right? But these conceptual arguments, along with the coherency of the notion of syntactico-semantic feature, dissolve completely in an architecture with late insertion at both interfaces. And in coming to see this, I was especially indebted to Omer Preminger, and I've got a citation here to a handout of his, and there's also his Aberlin talk, which is available on YouTube, which is quite excellent. And the inspirational nature of his work on related ideas here is not to be forgotten. In such a theory, there are rules of semantic interpretation, or allosomy, and there are rules of exponence, normally called vocabulary insertion in DM, which each apply independently to the output of syntax. So the prediction is that allosomy and allomorphy can't see each other, don't care about each other, and can in principle be orthogonal to each other. This is the correct prediction. In fact, in a great many cases, these things are orthogonal to each other. So these examples are based on one from Morant's 1984, and they also appear in a handbook article that Alec and I have written on conditioned allosomy that will appear one day, perhaps. Took us a long time to write it, admittedly, so it's not anybody else's fault than ours. But here's the point, right? So 10, 13, and 16 all involve a meaning for throw where it means vomit. Up, I would argue, is making its normal semantic contribution in these sentences. Sentences 11, 14, and 17 all involve a meaning for throw where it's what many people would think of as the normal meaning for throw, which is like launched through the air with some arm or arm-like mechanism, right? 12, 15, and 18 involve a special meaning for throw where it means something like lose a competition on purpose, right? Importantly, though, as the three batteries of examples here show, these three different uses of throw have all the same morphophonological irregularities, right? So as far as the morphophonology of English is concerned, these are the same guy, but they're not the same guy as far as the semantics is concerned. What does this mean? It means that the rules that assign the underlying phonological forms, and this is sort of a toy set of rules that would do that. Nothing material changes if through is not just a suppletive allomorph of throw. So, for example, on the far better analysis by Heather Newell, through arises because the past tense marker here is spelled out as a floating vowel of some variety that gets sort of that supplants the stem vowel. But even if you were to change this analysis to that better one, the point that the rules of allomorphy are applying orthogonally to the rules of semantic interpretation, of which I've given you some toy versions in 20, would still go through. So nothing material changes if you prefer, as you should, I think, a different analysis of the allomorphy of the stem itself here. Right? Once you're in such a theory, you are already committed to the idea that there are root-specific features in the syntax, like root 147, or at the very least, a sort of conjugation class features. So you could imagine, rather than having a list of roots here, conjugation class features that the roots themselves have, but then you'd still be committed to what I'm saying here, right? Given the Y model, these have to be in the syntax to be visible to both kinds of ruling 19 and 20, right? For empirical reasons, you're also committed to the idea that such features don't always have non-trivial semantic contributions associated with them. Here I've actually cited that article, the chapter of mine and Alex about allosomy. This argument goes back to Mark Aronoff. So this is from his 1976 monograph. And what he's pointing out here is that you have various words in which mit appears and various words in which these other sort of pieces appear. And there are prefixes that, to one extent or another, can go with each of these guys, right? Now, the interesting, important point here is that the mit series has some special allomorphy associated with it. So in particular, mit has a allomorph. It needn't be literally an allomorph. It could be sort of some special phonology or a special underlying representation of that final segment that's at issue here. The other little rootlets like shum and juice and crete and cert, for example, do not share. Namely, you get this miss before not only ion but also iv and other suffixes. So permit, permission, permissive, remit, remission, remissory, but excrete, excretion, excretive, assert, assertion, assertive, digest, digestion, digestive, and so on, right? Aronoff's point here is that speakers have to know at least one idiosyncratic thing about mit, right? But that means that mit has to be represented in the grammar somehow, despite the fact that it has no consistent meaning of its own. Of course, for Aronoff, that doesn't mean the same thing as it does for me. For me, that means that mit has to be a piece in the syntax. For Aronoff, it means something different, of course. There you are. Heidi Harley has pointed out the existence of cases like this involving free morphemes. Given all of this, I can see no conceptual barrier to the notion that features like optimaswets, plus minus alpha, plus minus beta, and plus minus gamma could be present in the syntax. There's no way to enforce a requirement that all morphosyntactic features have a non-trivial semantic contribution in such an architecture. No complications of the theory of phrase structure of the kind that Chomsky was worried about arise either. There's no deletion of uninterpretable features, there are just features, some of which occur as part of the structural description of particular rules of semantic interpretation, some of which don't. The syntax proper has no way of knowing which is which, and no reason to care about it even if it had. The notion that such features play no role in syntax has no obvious force either to me. Pieces don't have roles in syntax, except metaphorically. What they have is distributions, regulated in contemporary theories by operations triggered by features. And there's no conceptual barrier to stating distributions in terms of inflectional class features. And the footnote points to a paper of mine where I do just that for declension class features in the Latin noun. Now, there are possible empirical issues with the idea that inflectional class features could be present in the syntax, but those don't seem insurmountable to me. So a couple of them are articulated by Alexiadou and Muller, 2008. They're talking about nominal declension. And they point out that no verb C-selects for only a certain declension class of nouns, but no verb C-selects for any aspect of nominal functional structure. And we don't conclude from that, for example, determiners are not in the syntax. We might conclude that they're not heads, which is what Benjamin Bruning does. But nobody seriously suggested that they're not in the syntax on these grounds. Another one from Alexiadou and Muller. Inflectional class features are never spread to dependence under concord. There's no declension class agreement on adjectives, unlike for gender and number, right? But adjectives themselves have declension classes inherently. But they don't have gender inherently, right? So perhaps this is a matter of locality. So the piece that spells out declension class features will be nearest to the declension class features on the adj. But given that adjectives don't have inherent gender features, the nearest thing that has gender features that a gender morpheme could agree with will be the noun that the adjective is modifying or being predicated of or whatever. Likewise, if every little v head in Latin and Romance had at least one conjugation class feature, locality would ensure that theme vowel allomorphy is only ever sensitive to the nearest v. And that would suffice to give the impression that these features never spread under agree. Right? It's never long distance enough for it to be noticeable. Here is a more serious problem. And I, in preparing this talk, had struggled to remember cases where this has been brought up in literature before. I remembered being shown an argument of this nature by Alec Morantz in a class when I was a graduate student. But people in the audience pointed out cases to me that I'll have to look up. So there's a paper by Harley and Blanco 2013, for example, on Yaqui suppletion and conjugation classes, which argues that the conjugation classes have to be a property of the stem. Another thing that's been mentioned to me is in an article, which I had read actually, I just forgotten this part of it, by Maria Guskova and Jonathan Bobolik that I'll have to take a look at, making a similar kind of argument. But here is the form of the argument, and it's potentially very serious for this perspective of mine. So take, for example, Latin. So the verb that means the normal verb for carry in Latin is very, very suppletive. And some of its suppletive allomorphs have theme vowels that are consistent with it being in the third declension. So ferebat, she was carrying. Tulit, tul is the perfective allomorph, the perfective suppletive allomorph here. She is carried. But then the past participle is latus, right? And the R in there looks at least exactly like the first conjugation theme vowel. Now, that's a potentially very serious problem, as I say, because it would seem to indicate that the conjugation class features are really a property of the vocabulary item rather than the syntactic piece. However, I don't think this apparent problem is going to be insurmountable either, although there's a big IOU here, and an even bigger one than appears in the handout, actually, given the Slavic cases that were brought to my attention and the Yaqui cases that I do need to engage with. But the cases of this that I was familiar with in preparing the handout are actually better analysed in terms of lexical decomposition and or impoverishment. In particular, because such changes of conjugation class across different TAM combinations are often found also in the absence of root suppletion. So one case in point is the Spanish verb to give, which in a great many of its forms acts like a well-behaved first conjugation verb. So its infinitive is dar. Its past imperfect is daba, dabas, daba, the indicative that is. But then in the preterite and related tenses, it suddenly starts acting as if it's a third conjugation or second conjugation verb. So you get di, diste, dio, dimos, distes, dieron, right? So there you've got the conjugation class change, but no root suppletion. And that suggests to me that there will be a way of dealing with these Latin cases, and if we're lucky, the Yaqui cases and the cases discussed by Bobolik and Guskova, where this is just sort of like an accidental coincidence of suppletion and impoverishment of theme vowel conjugation class features, and that it's actually nothing directly to do with the suppletive allomorphs, as suggested by the DAD case, where you've got the change in conjugation class but not suppletion. Given that the jury's still out on those, and given all the other arguments I've made, I conclude that conjugation class features could be syntactic after all. Now, given that they could be, we have to decide whether they are or not. How shall we do that? And I will address this now after a digression to talk about modularity. So this is section 3, strict Fodor plus modularity. So grammar consists of subsystems which trade in representations of rather different kinds. Though morphosyntax has features like n, v, a, p, plus minus finite, the root symbol, indices like 147. Phonology of spoken languages involves things like nasal, plus minus back, and in signs languages, per Brentari 2019, we've got crossed and ulnar, things of this nature. And semantics has all these cheerful variables and quantifiers and predicates and relations and these things. And these are very different looking animals. And a plausible and strong hypothesis is that each of these subsystems is a module in the sense of Fodor 1983. A Fodorian module exhibits a number of properties, including domain specificity, so its representational vocabulary is specific to that module, and no other thing that is a module can read it, and informational encapsulation. So while other parts of the mind, modules or not, may access the output of a module, they cannot interfere with the module's internal computations. So any theory of grammar in terms of Fodorian modules has to confront the question of how the relationship between modules is governed. And obviously, at the very least, we need to state correspondences across these different representational alphabets. Let's call these rules of transduction. In versions of DM with late insertion at both interfaces, there are two types of rules of transduction, both of which apply to syntactic structure. And these are just reminders of what those look like. So 22, we've got a rule of exponents that applies to root 147 in a certain environment, and we've got a sample case of a rule of semantic interpretation that applies to the same piece. So, I should have mentioned, by the way, that this squiggly arrow notation for the rules of semantic interpretation is inspired by, adapted from the really excellent textbook on formal semantics by Lucas Champollion and my colleague Liz Coppock. They use a single squiggly arrow. The double squiggly arrow is meant to emphasize the fact that these two types of rule are identical in format. They just differ in the representational alphabets that they involve, right? That they transduce to. Now, the strongest and simplest hypothesis about the architecture of the grammar from the point of view of modularity would be that this is all we need. That is, that there are no rules which mix and match the representational vocabularies of morphosyntax, semantics, and phonology, except the rules of transduction. And this is the hypothesis which Newell and Saylor, following work by Tobias Scheer, urges to pursue. And for reasons that I will reveal, because I was challenged at this talk, I've taken to calling this strict Fodor plus modularity. The plus is in there because Fodor allowed for cases where things were sort of modular to an interesting extent, but not fully strictly modular. So, and I agree with his arguments for saying that. So indeed, in a book from the late 90s of his called "The Mind Doesn't Work That Way," he made a very, very strong argument that the massive modularity thesis had to be wrong. So the massive modularity thesis is the thesis that everything in the mind is a module in this strict sense. Fodor's argument, which I commend to you, it's a brilliant little book, shows to my satisfaction that at least some things within the mind can't be strict modules. But there may be parts of the mind that are modular to some interesting extent, and there may be parts of the mind that are strictly modular in this super strict sense where you've got complete domain specificity and complete informational encapsulation. And in cases where that has a chance of being right, we should pursue that hypothesis because it's the strongest one. My position here is that I think it does have a chance of being right for morphosyntax, phonology, and semantics. And then there will be transducers relating syntax to those other two that look like the ones in 22. Now, a version of DM which adheres to strict Fodor plus modularity would have the following properties. You would have to abandon readjustment rules because they make reference to phonological and morphosyntactic primitives simultaneously, but are not transductive. And the slack would have to be taken up either by the rules of exponence or by phonology. I'm a kind of outsider to that debate, but I have big sympathies here, and they're in favor of the second option, which has been pursued very impressively, to my reckoning, in recent work by Heather Newell, Chantil Spionin, their co-authors and their students, including Perez Herrera 2023 here. Another consequence is that operations which manipulate morphosyntactic tree structures, like fission, fusion, impoverishment, node sprouting, lowering, and generalized reduplication as it appears in Aragian-Nevins 2018, would have to be either reconstrued as part of the morphosyntax module, that is, as syntactic operations, or abandoned entirely. All of these operations map phrase markers into phrase markers. By domain specificity, that means they have to be syntactic or not exist, right? So you have to do one or the other. Now, I'm not here in a position to offer you a counter-analysis of, say, everything that's in Aragian-Nevins 2012, the Basque auxiliary book, but that's a massive IOU, supposing that I go down the route of abandoning those operations entirely. The only other option, if you're taking strict modularity seriously, is complicating your syntax enormously, because there's no coherence in this way of thinking to the notion that you could have something that manipulates tree structures that wasn't syntactic. They could be late syntactic, right? So there could be, if they're part of the syntax, it might be true of the syntax module that all of the rules of this nature apply after merge and agree, but they would still be in the syntax, and they would have to be given domain specificity if they exist at all. So, as you can see just from this, adhering to strict Fodor plus modularity has interesting and wide-ranging consequences for DM as a framework. And a surprising instance of this, which I've been teasing you with since the beginning of this, concerns Romance conjugation class features. Here it comes. An argument that conjugation class features must be syntactic in a certain version of strictly modular DM. Premise 1. Syntax is a module in the strict Fodor plus sense, meaning that it obeys domain specificity. In concrete terms, this means that there is a representational alphabet with syntactic features which satisfies the following conditions. A. It is the only representational alphabet that syntax can read. B. No other Fodorian module can read it. Premise 2. The Y model is true. Premise 3. Phonology and semantics are also modules in the strict Fodor plus sense. Rules of exponence and rules of semantic interpretation, I remind you, are transducers rather than modules. Premises 1, 2, and 3 together are just the definition of a strictly modular version of DM. Premise 4, impoverishment rules exist. That just makes this a version of DM with impoverishment, like standard DM. Premise 5, impoverishment rules have the format X goes to 0 in the environment of Y and Z, where Y and Z may be empty. X and, when non-empty, Y and Z in the schema are syntactic features. That's the definition of impoverishment, the standard one, right? 6 is a lemma. By 1 through 5, impoverishment rules are part of the syntax. This has been suggested before by other people I'm citing here, but not for this reason. Premise 7. Romance conjugation features sometimes undergo impoverishment. Theorem, conclusion, 8. By 6 and 7, Romance conjugation class features are part of the syntax. This is probably the time to discuss the fact that 6 and 5 in combination seem to predict that there should be semantically potent cases of impoverishment. So this is a worry, and I do take it as a worry, that was brought up during the talk and has been brought up in posts on my Facebook page about the handout. And I agree it's a worry. Now, the literature does contain cases where people have claimed that semantically potent impoverishment happens. So there's work by Anton Carl Ingerson that has this idea. Andrew Nevin suggested a term for this kind of thing. He proposed in a handout from a Roots workshop years ago, calling semantically potent impoverishment deprivation. There's also an antecedent for it in the work of all people, Richard Kane. So if you look at Richard Kane's work on suppletion recently, he suggests that went, the past tense of go, is in fact just the past tense of one of the past tenses of the verb to wend, as in to wend one's way. And that there's an independent reason why go can't combine directly with the past tense morpheme to give you goed, right? And in doing that, Ritchie addresses the question of why it is that he went to the station doesn't have the same manner interpretation as, he wended his way to the station. And his account is that there's a deletion operation in the syntax that removes the manner component in the case of went, but not in wended. That deletion rule is a semantically potent impoverishment rule. See also my continua paper, where I point out that given that morphology is syntax, the theory that Richard Kane, and Chris Collins are pursuing has phonological features in the syntactic representations. That makes things like ellipsis and all other marking for deletion operations special cases of impoverishment because they, cause certain features that are in the syntactic representation to be ignored by phonology, right? So mass has impoverishment too, and there's an antecedent within mass, MAS, morphology of syntax, for semantically potent impoverishment. However, I'm far from persuaded that in general, this is going to be a really sort of like good prediction to be making. I have a couple of thoughts about it. So part of the fault here, I think, maybe lies with construing impoverishment as literally removing features. There are alternatives out there that you can imagine. Andrea Calabrese has entertained some. He has a process that I think he calls freezing, where what happens is you sort of mark a given feature in some fashion that the rules are sensitive to, so it's still in the representation, but it's not like gone. And if you reconstrued impoverishment in that fashion, it would still be a syntactic operation, but you would be able to sidestep any implication that something that is ignored by the phonological by the rules of exponents would necessarily be absent for the purposes of semantics too. Another consideration that occurred to me after the talk in thinking about a comment on Facebook was that if it turned out, as I think it certainly does turn out, that semantically potent impoverishment is a lot rarer than the morphologically potent, morphophonologically potent kind, that could have a plausible learnability-based explanation, right? So positing impoverishment rules involves noticing some kind of neutralization happening with respect to the rules of transduction. Those neutralizations are much easier to notice for the PF cases than for the LF cases, because for the LF cases, you have to, be able to infer that the meaning that's being conveyed as you're learning is a broader meaning than you would otherwise expect given the rest of your rule system. Therefore, you have to posit a impoverishment rule that specifically targets a feature that the rules of semantic interpretation are sensitive to, and that's inherently harder to do, I think. So if it turned but anyway, there is no running away from the fact that the architecture leaves open the possibility that impoverishment could have semantic effects. That's definitely a prediction. To the extent that attested cases are hard to find, what I've just said might be the reason. But to the extent that people are a bit squeamish about this consequence, I understand that. I nevertheless think that the other consequences are interesting enough, and the predictions about modularity strong enough that they don't. In this issue doesn't in and of itself dissuade me from a strictly modular DM. yet. So let me conclude. I think it's tolerably well known that I disagree with Collins and Kane 2023 about a lot of things. But I agree with their point that the possibility that theme vowels and conjugation class features are part of syntax has been dismissed too hastily in the DM literature. I've tried to argue here that the traditional theoretical and empirical arguments for keeping these things out of syntax all either fail to be convincing on the merits or lose coherency in the context of a theory with lace insertion at both interfaces. The conclusion that Romance conjugation class features could be syntactic or perhaps must be syntactic might disturb you, but it shouldn't. Not if you believe in the autonomy of syntax, as I do. Thank you for listening. Thank you to everyone at CRISP. Thanks to Heather Newell for letting me run the argument in section 4 by her before anybody else saw it. The end, there's an appendix which kind of shows you what this architecture, as I'm currently working it out, looks like a bit more concretely. Allow me to remind myself of some things that came up in discussion, which I did not mention already. Yes, so there were a number of questions about Slavic, and which is a language family that I'm embarrassingly ignorant of, except with respect to Ukrainian, which I've learned some of. So I think Harris's argument might not apply to Slavic straightforwardly. And actually, Ora Matushansky, who gave a talk at the same seminar a couple of weeks ago, convinced me that it doesn't apply to Russian. So she showed that in Russian, you can, without any loss of generality, assign the pieces that have been identified as theme vowels to the job of exponing various inflectional, semantically potent inflectional features. And the theme vowel allomorphy is plausibly reducible to phonological factors in Russian. I was convinced by her argument. I think that's right for Russian. It might be right for other Slavic, but as I say, I don't know. And there were a number of excellent Slavic experts in the audience who asked me questions about this, and they were talking about it in the chat as well, but I wasn't able to follow that, sadly. So Harris's argument certainly doesn't apply straightforwardly to Russian, and may not extend so easily to other Slavic. And that's fine. It's very possible if what Ora was arguing generalizes to other Slavic, then it might be that Slavic has nothing like Latin Romance theme vowels at all in its verb system. And that's fine. I'm quite sanguine about languages varying in terms of what functional categories they have. That's part of the reason why I'm not a nanosyntactician. I'm not a radical cartographer. And there was some discussion of, given that Harris's argument doesn't apply so straightforwardly, are we then left with the argument from syncretism? And I think yes. I think in principle you might still be able to make the argument from syncretism for some Slavic. And then I would just be saying that the same conclusion, that you've got conjugation class features and that the theme vowel itself is the realization of something in the syntactic structure, would hold in those Slavic languages as well, just that the actual evidence for that being true would be weaker for those languages. I was asked a number of other big picture questions, not all of which I'm in a position to recall to my mind and address right now. But I was asked, and I invited this, really, I brought it on myself. Why, this was the last question that was asked of me, why I myself place myself under this stricture in the first place. The stricture being, if you're committed to the idea that the lexicon contains simple pieces only. Why am I committed to that? Well, the options that involve abandoning that are Ricardo Bermúdez Otero's theory and nanosyntax, OG nanosyntax with phrases, with phrasal spell out, right? And for nanosyntax, and actually this particular issue extends to span-based versions as well. Like if you, so I'm okay with spans and not cartography, but if you're doing span-based nanosyntax, then you're doing spans and cartography, and I'm not a radical cartographer. I'm just not. And this is not the space to go into why that is, but this is just given that um, I'm not. I've decided not to join in the nanosyntax exercise, the nanosyntax enterprise. Sorry, let me emphasize, I'm a pluralist. So I think that people should work on the simplest idea they can think of in their estimation. So it's their estimation of simplicity that matters. That has a chance of being correct. And again, it's their judgment on whether it has a chance of being correct that matters. So I think we all have the right to our own research programs, which we should construct based on our evaluations of those two factors. What's the simplest idea that I can think of that has a chance of being correct? And we should pursue those. So we have that right, and we also have the obligation to hear each other out, to be open-minded about the results of research coming out of research programs that start from very different starting assumptions. Right? So I'm not saying that I think that nanosyntacticians should stop. They should not. They should carry on. They shouldn't outsource their judgment of these assessments to me, nor will I outsource my judgment on these to them. Right? Nevertheless, that's where I am. Right. On Bermúdez Otero's architecture, which is a very, very interesting architecture. It's a version of the parallel architecture associated with Ray Jackendorf, coupled with a cyclic stratal OT based morphophonology. And it's a very interesting architecture. I've I haven't embraced it myself because I am convinced that dual root models in general, of which Bermúdez Otero's is explicitly an instance, are not correct, and that single mechanism composition and storage with all, but any storage is always with composition, decomposition is correct. And that plus what I've said about cartography makes me a DM person and not rather than something else. But anyway, even if you don't have the same evaluation as me of those issues, hopefully you still find some value in knowing what the trade-offs are. So all I can ask is, or all I can really attempt is to persuade you that this material implication holds. And it's hard for me to judge whether I did that in the talk. I can't judge whether I've done that for anybody watching this video. But yes, the discussion was very lively, and I felt like it went well, and I had a great time. And I recommend the TCC seminar to anybody. Get in touch with Jeroen van Kranenbroek if you would like to be added to the mailing list. Otherwise, that's all from me. Thank you very much. And I welcome comments on the video or elsewhere or by email. I've had a fantastic email from Guy Twaschik actually that I'll have to get to. But anyway, thank you. See you soon.